Chapter 37. Their trek back to the bridge was done in silence. Samus walked next to Rock, his head high, but rage in his eyes. Once they had all seen the remnants of the citizenry that had been piled high, the elation of the easy essence harvest had faded. Now they walked drenched in the blood of the innocent, their own deaths having been narrowly diverted. That thing was foul, and I can only imagine there are more of them. So many of my people have been taken today. The loss, it just can't be comprehended. Samus's words were more of a plea than anything else. Ever since Rock had lost the ability to speak, he had found that many people enjoyed using him as a way to voice their own thoughts, seeing as he couldn't easily interject and stop their flow. Millions lived in the capital Rock. Millions. How few remain now? The palace still stands and the armory and small areas here and there, but how many have died today? Or worse yet, still live, but changed? Samus's voice trailed off at the end and he shook himself from his own reverie. Nevia and her troops said nothing. They just continued to walk quietly behind the pair as the prince vented. Rock glanced back at them and saw the same worry, the same fear and horror in their eyes. All of them had family or loved ones in the city whose fates were unknown. They took the elevator slowly, all of them letting Rock ride by himself back to the upper levels. He waited for them as it took 2 trips to haul everyone up, and then they moved as a group to the hangar. The large blast doors were open and Rutledge and Julius looked at them and quickly frowned at the dour nature of the group. "You live," the small dragon said, joy in its voice as it glided through the air. "The creature is killed, but I fear there is a greater threat. There were these symbols, Professor Rutledge. They drew us all in, snared our minds until we were nothing more than puppets. I used an ability to weaken the effect, and Rock was able to break free, but we saw no signs of the one who made the symbols. Take me to them, maybe I can see what they are," Rutledge ordered. Nevia looked around and then pointed towards the pair of soldiers who had stood guard. "Escort the professor. The ship is cleared, but be careful." "Yes, ma'am," Constance said. The trio left without a word and a silence descended on the group. 2 on the door, everyone else, rest. "Spirit, is there a functional washroom?" Nevia asked. "Yes, the captain's quarters are there." The dragon pointed with its tail at a subtle door that blended in with the background. "It is a functional sink and an independent water reservoir. Rotate in and out. Clean up and get some water in you." Nevia slipped down to the ground, her legs no longer having the strength to support her. 2 of her soldiers slumped against the doorway leading out of the bridge, their casters dangling from their hands as they looked out. The entire group was nearing collapse. Samus swayed on his feet and even Rock could feel the wall approaching. "Spirit, we came here to see if there was a chance you could help Rock. He is mute and needs a way to communicate with others, and many don't know the silent tongue," Samus said. He leaned against a console and watched the floating blue dragon. "Oh, certainly. I am currently bound to this ship, but, and I say this with all due respect to those who built it, it's rather limited. If you wish to, we could bond and then I'd be able to access your thoughts and be able to speak for you," the dragon said, voice chipper. "Bond?" Samus asked. His eyes were drooping as he struggled to stay up on his feet. "Yes. I would weld a piece of myself to the Lord Bloodsworn. This would effectively change me permanently, turning me from a spirit of intellect and into a bonded spirit." "That entails, what?" Samus asked. "Well, I would grow with Rock, taking a piece of every iota of essence he consumes to fuel my own growth. With that I would be able to help him with granting further access to the system and give detailed reporting beyond the basic information that is presented." Rock had heard enough. He set down his spear and offered the dragon his free hand. The dragon didn't hesitate, flying around and wrapping around the armor like a snake, head ending at his shoulder as it gazed up at him and through the slit of his helm. "Bond spirit of intellect? Y/N." Rock pressed yes with his mind and icy fire suffused his body. The dragon melted through his armor like it wasn't there, melting into him as the fire froze his veins. It was the chill of the deep north, where the sun's light didn't touch. Arctic gales that froze a man to the bone in heartbeats, The frigid waters filled with islands of ice. It was home and it was death. It was the line he had walked since he was a child. "Oh, there's so much room in here," the dragon said as it burst from his skull. Samus snickered terribly as he slid to the ground, sword across his lap. Navia chortled, her eyes open, but drooping. "Arak is thinking quite unkind thoughts about you and your parentage. Especially you, Prince Samus." Arak glared at the dragon as it poured out of his helmet and floated in the air next to him. The dragon turned back to look at him, wispy white eyebrows that looked like clouds raising off of its skull. "Oh. I don't believe I was supposed to say that. My apologies." "Well. Arak's apologies." "Oh, this is humorous," Julius muttered, so softly that Arak almost didn't hear him. "Arak doesn't believe it is. In fact, he's imagining me skinned and flayed with my horn used as the handle to a cane. It's quite graphic death. I wonder if he understands I'm incorporeal." The dragon smiled tethily at him. Arak was wishing he had thought this out a bit more. He pulled his helmet off and slowly lowered himself to the ground and leaned against a wall as the dragon cavorted around him. "I need a name," the dragon said. It spun back and glared at Arak as he thought it. "That is foul and I will not. I was thinking something majestic, as befitting my nature." "Pump," Navia chimed in. Her eyes were closed and her chin was tucked into her armored chest. "I like it. I shall be Pump." Arak rolled his eyes but sat back and watched as everyone else went into the captain's quarters and washed themselves off. They were close to their goal, so close he could taste it. "Oh, Arak. As part of our bond I can see beyond the physical plane and see your soul. All of your souls really. They are all greatly strained and the exhaustion you are all slowly falling to is natural. A few hours sleep and you'll be better than new. It's all the essence you've absorbed today. It's tiring to absorb it. I'll stay awake and watch over you all while you rest," Pump said as he floated around the room. Arak's eyes failed to stay open and his last sight was of the entire room slumbering. Chapter 38. Arak woke with a start and was face to snout with the floating spirit. The dragon blinked slowly and then smiled wide. So close to it, Arak could see the exquisite detail of the scales and the mathematical equations written into each one of them. Pump swished through the air spinning around to face the rest of the group, all of them awake and alert. Arak's awake and wondering why nobody woke him up. The overly excited spirit shouted out. Its voice was high-pitched as a child's and it danced around the air in joy with every spoken word. "You needed to sleep. We sent a runner and the engineer still hasn't finished working on the door, but she's close. By the time we get down there, she should have the door open," Samus said. Navia grunted in confirmation and Arak was forced along as he rose to his feet and they all began to troop out of the bridge of the uncompleted research vessel. Arak had to admit to himself that he had needed the rest. However many hours it had been, it felt like a full night's rest. He stretched his back, twisting this way and that to a series of thunderous pops as he groaned in relief. His neck cracked like an ancient tree and everyone stopped to stare at him. Are you all right?" Samus asked. "Yes. My pain has been reduced to manageable levels and now I seek foes so I may drench my blade in their blood and consume their strength." Pump Delcard perched on Arak's shoulder. Arak glared at the dragon. That wasn't what he was thinking. "Oh. You like any humor, Arak? Arak says he is fine and wishes to continue on. Blah, blah, duty, honor, queen. Oh. That's interesting. No, of course not. I'll keep that to myself." The overjoyous dragon zoomed off Arak's shoulder while everyone looked at him suspiciously. Arak shrugged and was glad for his helm that kept their peering eyes away from his scarred face. "I think we may have been better served without the spirit," Navia muttered as they all watched the little bastard dart around in the air. He had a sheen to him, a light that emanated from his ethereal body that helped brighten the corridors. "At least we have a light now," one of the soldiers said and there was a general chuckle at that. The rest of the journey through the floating docks was done in silence. The tension had been broken, the nap they had all taken soothing sore nerves. There was something to the dragon's warning of strange souls that resonated with Arak. He could feel how much more he was in tune with his own body now. His strength seemed as familiar now as his old body had. Near the end, before he had fallen asleep, it had almost come as a surprise how fast he could move and strike. The engineer was slumped on the ground, face streaked in a layer of grease, and there were a small series of burns on her hands as she stared at the huge blast doors that kept the Sword of Empire apart from the interior of the floating docks. She looked over to them and the deep crescents beneath her eyes spoke of her exhaustion. "Oh, you're here. It's done. Just click the button and she opens up." She pointed at a small button and Iraq didn't hesitate as he reached over and pressed the button down. The doors hissed open and then Iraq was striding into the ancient war vessel. Warning, entering a legendary domain. Sword of Empire. Iraq paused as he read that, but then he was moving again. Pump floated behind him and Samus's steps echoed lightly from behind. Nevia was collecting her 2 soldiers who hadn't found time to sleep yet, and hustled them inside. Rutledge was remarking about what a domain was while Julius scurried past them all and nearly ran to catch up to Rock. "That woman terrifies me. Please don't leave me alone with her," Julius whispered to Samus. The prince just laughed and clapped the older man on the shoulder. "We are near the end of our goal. I have a feeling this might be the safest place in the entire capital right now." "It matters little how safe it is, if the danger is already in the ship with us," Julius protested. "Iraq thinks you need to stand up for yourself and stop letting Rutledge bully you. You will always live in her shadow and be consumed by fear if you can't stand firm," Pump said joyfully, perching himself on Iraq's shoulder and looking over at Julius. Iraq ignored it, heart beating with ferocity as he got closer to the bridge. The hulls were polished steel, bare and uniform, designed for their lethal practicality. Everything about this ship reminded him of a drawn sword, naked steel poised to commit violence. The central hull was wide enough for 4 people to walk abreast and lead to the heart of the great ship. Blast doors stood wide open and the empty feel of the ship made the hairs on the back of his neck stand up. Nothing came for them as they marched down the hall, Nevia's squad behind them. Entering the bridge, Iraq looked about. It was a cavernous room, thrice the size of the bridge that they had pulled Pump from. A throne-like seat sat in the middle of the room. If seated one could see the entirety of the bridge and out through the thick glass of the viewports to the world beyond. The pitch-black night offered nothing besides the haze of the fires, the dull red gleam warming the night. Standing next to the viewport, looking down upon the fires, was an old woman. White hair that streamed down her back to pool at the floor. Straight back and broad shoulders, a short sword hung from her hip. Iraq stepped into the bridge and the old woman turned to look at him. Pump screamed. Iraq's mind went blank and distantly he felt people bumping into him. He stared into the gunmetal gray eyes of the woman and felt himself being dragged away. Images of the past flashed by him. Smoke-choked skies filled with other warships. Cracked hulls belching fire as desperate warriors leapt free. A madness filled Iraq as he stared at the falling foes. Pity and disgust at those too weak to face her in the skies. The vision shattered like glass and the old woman had transformed. Gone was the ancient crone and a warrior queen in her prime stood there. A cloak of blood-stained flax, stitched together with ugly black thread, hung from a shoulder and over the edge of her throne to the floor. A golden helm, gleaming in the light, hid most of her features. A proud nose and a vicious white smile. Thick metal armor covered her from neck to toe, all of it pitted and scarred from hard use. Her gunmetal gray eyes hadn't changed. She sat there on a throne made of cracked hulls, her feet propped up on a pile of crowns, melted together in an ugly mass. A blood-caked sword sat across her lap and one hand gently stroked the edge of the blade as she stared intently at them. She opened her mouth and the sounds of cannons came roaring out, barely decipherable as speech. "I am Empire. Who dare walks my deck?" Chapter 39. Power radiated off the spirit as she stared them down, imperious and unfazed by the group. Iraq towered over her seated form, but he felt small as her hard eyes swept over them. "I am Prince Samus of House Greenbat, 17th Prince of the Empire," Samus said, his voice proud and clear, not bowed at all by the presence of the powerful spirit. Green bow. I remember them. They brought their king here to my decks, mewling and sobbing as he pledged his undying loyalty to the throne. Then he gave 3 of his daughters to the emperor and pledged 10,000 swords to the unification. King Vaira, the Broken. He was a few generations ago. I have little relation to the man. Piss water in their veins, all of them. That the blood of House Visir has tainted itself with cowards like your ancestors is a disgrace. It paused and its lips quirked ever so slightly to reveal shining steel teeth. You have the fire of the old ones though. The original warriors who strode my decks and launched themselves against the world. Driven by pride and ambition. You will go far if you don't find yourself bleeding out in the cold mud. She left Samus open-mouthed as she turned to look at the rest. Crone, I see you. Curiosity bordering on madness. A desire for control. You there, coward who clings to her shadow, your fear and impotent rage is palatable. Warriors, your discipline keeps you moving even as your hearts are shattered, you have my admiration. The spirit named them all, pointing out and speaking to them individually or in groups until she looked to Rock. And you? What pale mimicry of arms and armor do you wear? Dagger's armor and Halcyon's spear. They stood behind the unifier or led his armies. Loyal, dependable, fearless, dutiful. I can see the chains of duty on you, giant-born. They control the hunger inside of you. She sighed and looked away from them, shimmering in the light as her body and the surrounding rippled. None of you are worthy of the mantle, she said, disappointed. The mantle? Samus asked. I am powerful inside of my domain, that is true. But at the end of the day, I am a ship's spirit. And a ship needs a captain. The one who controls my mantle has the strength to command me. And if they aren't to your liking? Samus asked. Fools and pretenders can cling to power like leeches, sapping away the strength of the Empire. I will not have that on my decks. If one is unworthy and tries to push their claim, they will find that death is not always fast. Are you willing to kill that giant asshole in the portal over the Iron Cathedral? Arok asked, his fingers wagging clumsily in his gauntlets. Spirit. Find your courage and speak for your partner. You must not judge us based on the whelp. He is young and naive, like a child. Pump slowly poked the head out of the shoulder of Arok's armor and looked between the two figures. Arok wishes to know what needs to be done for you to kill the creature in the gate above the Iron Cathedral. Pump's voice was much more subdued, his earlier behavior curbed by Sword's very presence. My mantle is the captain's sword. A priceless relic that was forged by the dwarf Hathvar the Iron-handed from the hull of the first ship I sent to the Earth's embrace. The lickspittle who held it took it to cavort with whores and drunkards down below. He is dead, but someone else has picked up the blade. Someone who may be worthy. I can feel their fire, their desire to exert their will and seize the horizons. Bring them to me and I will be able to activate my guns. Arok wished to spit and curse. Another quest to deal with before he could reach the Queen. He looked past Sword and towards where the palace would be. All he could see were the fires framed by the night, the skies choked in a blanket of smoke. The palace still holds, Sword said. Her hands waved at the viewport and the glass rippled and the view changed. The ever-present smoke and flames disappeared, the night turned bright as daylight but no building were seen. Instead the sky was filled with motes of black-red energy and when he looked down the city was awash with these dots. Essence. That is what you are seeing now. As a spirit, we straddle the realms, physical and ethereal. Look through the palaces, Sword said. Arok looked and swallowed hard. It was a torch in the darkness, glowing gold and crimson as it raged against the sea of black-red dots arrayed against it. He glanced at the Iron Cathedral and the inhabitant above it and his mouth went dry. The portal was blazing white gold and the creature chained to it had a cord of white so bright and fierce it made his eyes water. The thick black cords of corruption ran through the outer edges of the massive shape, inching slowly to the untouched center. Once that being is fully corrupted, the palace will fall. The defenses cannot hold against something of that magnitude. Bring the mantle holder to me and if they are worthy, then we shall sail the sky yet again and serve our true purpose. She froze and her smile widened further revealing a mouth with too many teeth. She chuckled low and deep, and it was the sound of ships breaking, explosions, and men screaming. "We shall erase these vermin from our world," and then, she looked at the portal, and Arak knew she was seeing distant planes and new worlds to conquer. She shook herself out of her reverie. "But first, a captain is needed. Down there," she pointed, and the viewport magnified until Arak was seeing a mass of gold and crimson dots fighting hordes of small black-red dots. "Bloodsworn. You shall do this alone. If you succeed, I have a boon for you." "No," Navia said, striding forward. "Child, there is much to do and there is no crew. I have not sailed to war in centuries and the peace has made me rusty. You shall need every hand you have to prepare for the fight ahead. Bring forth those below in the armory and we shall staff these halls once more. The Bloodsworn will only be slowed by you. These creatures are strengthened by the darkness. It's all right. You have done your duty, and now I must do mine," Pump said from his shoulder. "The Bloodsworn will return. He is not the type to fail," Sort said. "Let Arak go. We will do our part here and get this old girl ready to fly and commit war crimes again." Samus patted Navia's shoulder and the woman stood down. A shape was flying towards them. Larger than the rest, it was the same sickly colors as the Hellspawn but thrice their size. It sped across the city towards them at considerable speed, but it'd still be several minutes before it reached the ship. "Bloodsworn, a challenge for you. There is a functioning elevator there," Sort pointed toward a door against the back wall of the bridge. "Go up and kill whatever that is. Until my guns are online, I have precious few defenses from an outsider attacking me." Arak nodded, frustrated by another delay, but he knew missions could go astray. This was the final piece he needed to get the ancient battleship on his side, then he would kill this foe, retrieve the mantle, and bring it back. He didn't look at his companions as the door to the elevator closed and he was whisked to the top of the ship. His heart began to pulse that eager beat once again. Chapter 40. The elevator opened silently and a heavy stench of smoke billowed over him as he walked out across the flat decks of the warship. The pitted and scarred surface of the warship had been cleaned up, metal replaced in a patchwork of armor that looked like a patchwork quilt. Arak searched for where that flying shape would be, but the choking smoke was impossible to see through. "I can help you, if you approve. I can do a lesser version of what Sword did, for a short period of time," Pump said, finally emerging from his armor and poking his whiskery snout about. Arak nodded and the word flashed as he felt essence gather around him and then burn his eyes with the slightest of stings. The world was laid bare, becoming a sea of floating lights as he viewed the essence signatures. His foe was flying quickly, only moments away from hovering over the armory. Arak looked down at the ship and had to look away, the metal under his feet glowing vibrantly gold. The vision faded away and Pump panted loudly in his ear as if he had just run a long race. Arak walked across the deck, getting to the point that would be closest to where the shape would emerge. He stood there, spear in hand, and waited. The light from the fires below gave enough illumination that he could see the swirl of the smoke as the creature closed in. Funnels were formed in a rhythmic beat, smoke churning in just to be pushed out in a burst of power. Small at first, it rapidly grew in size until he realized it was closer to the size of the Deathsworn he had encountered earlier. Wings 3 times its height jutted from its back, leathery wings that cracked the air with every beat. A fiery, 3-tailed whip dangled from one hand, a small bronze buckler from the other. Black hair blew free in a sheet of onyx behind the female figure. She had wide shoulders and her armor was bronze with spikes erupting from her shoulders. Her face was bare and it was an angelic ruin. Cheekbones as sharp as a razor, cruel lips turned in a vicious smile as her whip twisted like a serpent. Corruption distorted her pale red skin, staining her skin in flaking rashes. A bolt of essence flew from the armory's walls, one of the cannons firing at the shrouded shape. Her whip flickered and one of the tails cut through the bolt of essence and it detonated in an explosion of crimson halfway between her and the armory. Laughter belted forth and it was terrible in its beauty. Fury LVL 29. A seraphim that has been corrupted by hellflame and bound to a lord of hell. Arak stared at the extra line of information before looking at Pump. The little dragon bounced about, some of its strength having already returned from his exertion. "I can glimpse pieces of truth. Not as much as your sage, but more than you could. Since we are bonded, you can now see more," the little dragon said. Arak shrugged. He didn't need the extra information to kill the creature. The Fury continued to float above the armory and cut apart the fortress's assaults with ease. Arak couldn't see much happening beneath the cover of the smoke clouds, but flashes illuminated the smoke as they raced around at ground level. Another assault on the walls. Arak thought towards Pump and the dragon turned to look at him, wiggly eyebrows raiding off of his brows. A tongue poked out as he looked down on the battlefield and then he nodded. "It'd be close, but possible. You have the ability and your armor is good enough to survive the initial clash. I don't advise it though. Your timing will have to be perfect." Pump froze when Arak looked at him and then sighed. "My apologies, my calculations will have to perfect. Just use it when I say. I just want to let you know, if you die, I die. I don't want to die the night I was born, Arak." Arak shrugged. Death came when it came. A bit more to the left. "She's moving in a circuit, she'll be closest to us in 40 seconds. Pump did the calculations while Arak crouched down, legs coiled like tight springs. The Fury burst into fire, an aura that lit the sky as her whip sent fiery bursts down on the defenders as she flew around the circumference of the fort. Each blast hit with the force of a bomb, bright light spilling across the ground. Down below, warriors were dying with no hope of ever facing this enemy. "Now!" Pump roared in his ear. The Fury was wheeling his way, wings beating lethargically as she continued to cast below her. She was a few hundred feet below him and closing fast. Arak moved without thought, all the force he could conjure as he leapt at where the Fury would be. The wind whistled through his helm and his eyes watered as he fell like an arrow toward his unsuspecting prey. The demon was still cackling as she slaughtered the defenseless soldiers. Arak kept his arms tied to his body, spear pointing down. Pump was nested with his snout next to Arak's ear, partially encapsulated in Arak's armor. For a moment, a gloriously long moment, Arak felt the weight of duty lift. The sharp point of his spear and the enemy before him the only thing in his world. A smile formed on his scarred face and he let a chuckle form and break free, the sound stolen on the screaming wind. Then the moment was gone and Arak was smashing through the haze of heat around the Fury. Heat blistered his face and fingers, the intense blaze heating the metal till he glowed, then he was through it and slamming into the demon. His rare spear pierced the demon through her back where her great wings came out, where the armor was thin and flexible. Her laughter turned into a shriek of pain and then they were tumbling. Arak clutched his buried spear with all his might and his free hand grasped at anything as the world spun. He grabbed a handful of her mane and clenched it tight as tried to right themselves so the Fury was facing the ground when they hit. His speed had diverted them away from the armory and toward the district that the mantle holder was supposed to be at. A whip lashed at him, burning a furrow across his back, charring the armor and leaving a small divot where the lash had streaked across it. Pain emanated from the strike, but Arak could do nothing but grit his teeth and continue to wrest the larger demon around, using his spear and handhold as points of leverage. The ground was growing large in his field of view. Buildings formed up around him, tall apartment complexes, towers of stone and metal with broken windows. Arak peered over the demon's shoulder and saw a 5-story building of yellow stone and he hoped nothing was inside of it. Then the building was taking up his entire view and Pump was screaming in his ear. Now. Chapter 41 Invincibility active. Duration 1 second. Stone burst asunder, turned to dust as the Fury and Arak crashed through a side wall and then through the floorboards and into the next floor. Air whooshed out of him as they slammed to a halt. The demon was groaning into the cracked floor of their impact and Arak slowly pushed himself to his feet. Dust clouds filled the air and he sneezed as he staggered backward. The invincibility had been a strange and fleeting feeling. The rush of power, essence pouring into him as if he was a balloon ready to burst. Then it had all flown away just as fast as it had arrived, leaving Arak on wobbly feet. Pump popped his head from Arok's shoulder and looked about the destruction. The dragon's head turned to look at the dying Fury and he growled as frost covered his snout. "Finish it." "It still lives," Pump whispered. Arok looked down at the Fury as she slowly gathered her arms under her and started to push up. His spear was still jutting from her back, the spikes on her armor were broken and just jagged stumps. Her hair had a thick patch missing and blood leaked from her scalp. Arok grabbed for his sword, flicking off the thong that kept it in its sheath and drew it before the demon could fully gather herself. He stepped forward and swung upwards toward her unprotected neck. The demon staggered away, alerted by something, and his sword cast sparks as it slid along her shoulders and tore a chunk from the back of her neck. She spun and flailed backward like a drunkard and the whip, which had been extinguished in their tumble through the floors, snapped around his leg. She jerked hard and Arok's leg was jerked out from underneath him. He crashed hard to the ground and cursed to himself as he slashed at the whip tendril with his sword. Leather parted with effort and Arok rolled to his feet. He raced toward the Fury, who still hadn't regained her balance. His sword sparked off her breastplate and then he crashed into her. They went flailing to the ground, Arok losing his sword in the tumble, and he lashed out with a gauntleted hand. Blood spattered against his helm, drops of it splashing into his eyes as he wailed on her. She punched him and he heard metal groan and he was tossed sideways toward the wall. The wall cracked beneath him and fell with another thud and slowly pushed himself back to his feet. The Fury was getting to her own feet, her face a wreck. Nose skewed to one side, gaps in her teeth as she breathed through her mouth. Blood caked her face as more pulsed from the wound in her neck. The tip of the spear was poking out of her breastplate and she swayed from side to side. Arok cracked his neck and stared up toward her. She tossed her whip handle to the side and from a hidden sheath in her armor, drew a long dagger that was nearly as long as a sword. She lunged forward and stabbed at him clumsily, Arok turning the blade away with his shield and punching her in the jaw. Her head rocked to the side and her knees folded as her momentum carried her armored mass into Arok. He grunted as they fell to the ground in a tangled mass. She stabbed at him again and this time he felt the pinch of armor on his hip and wet warmth trickle down his leg. A broken wing draped over him, hot and thin, and he grabbed it and hollow bones broke under his grip. The Fury twisted and cried out in pain and another dagger strike hit his gorget and he gasped as he felt the thinner metal flex and bow under the strike. He kneed her and pushed her away as he tried to get back to his feet. He threw a shield strike and hit her shoulder with the edge of his shield and a bone cracked. She kicked him and the force of the blow lifted Arok and tossed him towards the already broken stone of the wall. His back hit it and the wall failed and he tumbled through the wall in a sprawl of limbs. Arok leapt back up and watched as the Fury tried to escape. Her wings dragged limply behind her as she headed for the front door. Arok leapt after her, ducking through the hall and tackling her in the low of her back and bowing her backward as they slammed through the front door and out into the hallway. They rolled in a tangle and then they were falling, bouncing and twisting as they careened down the stairs to come to a crushing halt at the base of the stair. Arok was the first to recover and managed to get the full mount as he pounded down on the Fury. She bucked and he slid off of her as she heaved herself to her feet and slumped against the corner of the walls. She was ruined, her features lumpy and misshapen as the bones had been crushed and broken. Golden blood stained with black sludge ran down her face and across her dented and torn armor. Fear was absent in her gaze as she towered over Arok. The end was nigh and she refused to back down. She leapt at him, hitting him hard, and they went backward and down more stairs, until they landed in a clatter at the bottom floor. She rose up and punched him, his helm rattling as his head bounced off the floor. His vision swam but he saw the point of the spear was halfway out of her chest and he grabbed it. She froze as he jostled the spear, but Arok showed no mercy as he ripped it free, dragging it out through her torso in a screech of scraping metal. She went limp and folded up, falling to the side as the spear burst from her in a veritable fountain of gore. Arok was panting, every breath loud and echoing in the abandoned building as he tried to regain his composure. His body hurt, aching everywhere as his vision was still blurred. He pushed himself up and looked at the line of stairs they had fallen down on and thought of his sword lost in the wake of destruction the two of them had created. Fury LVL. 29 slain. Essence acquired. Level earned X3. Arak bit back a scream as essence flooded through him as the Fury stopped breathing. He slumped back against the wall as his limbs trembled and his heart beat frenetic in pace and his vision cleared up. Pump leapt from his armor, his blue scales gleaming with crimson essence as he fell to the floor, the essence soaking into his body. The little dragon grew, lengthening and growing sturdier in the shoulders and flanks as muscles were added. His eyebrows grew longer and the whiskers on his snout became crystalline and every imitation breath emitted a cloud of frost. As Pump stopped spasming he grew still and then floated back up to land weightlessly on Arak's shoulder. I have nearly double in strength from that, thank Arak. I'll be able to help you decipher more and eventually be able to interact with the physical world as we grow stronger. But, I am tired, I'm going to take a nap. The bonded spirit slipped into his armor and a familiar chill ran along his shoulders and neck as if he had an ice compress. Arak sighed and cleaned off his spear the best he could before stomping back up the stairs. He needed to get his sword back and the knife the Fury had dropped. One couldn't have too many blades after all. As he trudged up the steps he brought up his screen and smiled at the thought of growing stronger. Chapter 42 Bloodsworn LVL 17. Strength, 50. Vigor, 25. Durability, 25. Perception, 22. Processing, 21. Arak gasped as the flood of power staggered him as he walked up the steps. The increase to his strength was a sudden flood that made his mind reel. The smaller boosts to everything else took the slightest edge off of the effects of the fight. Arak pushed it all back as he found the room he had lost his sword in and grabbed it and resheathed it. The Fury's knife had been wedged partway into a wall and he tugged it free, the forearm-length blade of bronze uncommonly sharp. He looked at it and the designation popped up and he had to resist a small smile. Hellflame Bronze Dagger. Uncommon. Forged with Hellflame, this dagger requires no sharpening and is more durable than most blades. Durability for blade is a 1.2x multiplier to holder's durability stat. Arak stared at the extra information bobbing in his vision and huffed in annoyance. He didn't need the extra knowledge. He mentally flicked Pump for giving him the extra luggage. He dismissed it all and tucked the knife into his weapons belt, trying to remind himself to go and get the demon's sheath. There was a new skill for him to take as well. The normal aura abilities were available and so were the skill attacks. Shield Bash and a new attack called Sword Sweep, but the after effects of the last time he had improved his essence capabilities were still fresh in his mind. Bond Construct. Using essence form a physical body for your bond. Increasing skill levels will increase durability and duration of construct. Arak could understand immediately where having Pump as a physical creature would be helpful. He selected the skill and had an internal sigh of relief when he saw he didn't need to improve his essence stats. He went back down the steps and looted the Fury's body. The blade's sheath was cleverly tucked into the small of her back and he ripped it free and repositioned it to sit on his hip. She had nothing else of value on her, the whip destroyed and the shield missing after their tumble through the sky. Arak walked out of the building and back on the streets and had to take a few minutes to figure out where they had crash-landed. They had fallen in the general direction of the red light district where Sword's Mantle Holder was supposed to be. It was still a few miles away and the only light came from the out-of-control fires throwing red illumination across everything. Arak started forward, eyes sweeping the crevices all around him, alert for an ambush. With every step further forward the tension mounted. The dancing and twisting shadows around him, the impenetrable ceiling of smoke that rippled with the passage of winged demons. Nothing challenged him as he walked. The distance melted away and soon he could hear the clamor of battle. The sizzling hiss of flesh burning under cast of fire, the screams of men and women as they were consumed by demons, the general chatter of people and demons organizing. Arak moved faster and left the tightly packed housing district as he moved lower into the Imperial City. The hills that formed the corners of the valley that the city sprawled across pooled here. Workers had dug and reinforced the ground and soon ancient stone and weathered wood rose above Arak's head. There was a sense of antiquity here, beneath the squalor and spray paint and neglect. It was one of the original parts of the city, and its age showed in the neglect and tight corridors of twisting and poorly built structures. The road had condensed from wide boulevards to narrow streets, hardly wide enough for 3 men to walk side by side. Shattered glass crunched under his feet, turned to dust under his weight. Corpses were sprawled out, white and pale in death, the beginning of the bloat setting in. Something skittered above him, a dark shape moving across the close rooftops, and Arak froze for a moment. He shifted his grip on his spear and shield and then pushed forward. The battle ahead called to him, and he needed to bring back the mantle holder sooner rather than later. He rushed forward and heard something hit the ground behind him, flesh on stone slapping in rapid cadence, and he spun around, thrusting the spear in a smooth motion. The creature leapt, bloated and pale, and the spear ripped through its engorged stomach with the sound of a waterskin tearing. Blood splashed out in a wave, sloping across the pavement as the creature yowled in pain. It twisted and landed lightly, hissing as it slashed out with 3-inch-long claws. Arak used his shield to deflect the strike, but the power behind it staggered him, causing his eyes to widen as the creature roared like a lion. It had a mouthful of jagged teeth, blood-stained black, and a long tubular tongue that lashed the air. Its nude body was sexless and flabby, rolls of skin hanging off it as crimson eyes rolled in their round sockets. It lacked any hair, and its scalp was raw and bleeding, scabs all over it as it slashed at Arak again. Lesser Blood Leech LVL 18. A black alchemy experiment that has produced questionable results. Arak shrugged off the attack, bracing his feet and stabbing it again. This time the spear tip didn't rip skin, but punctured through its sternum. It froze and then screamed again, gurgling as clotted blood rolled out of its mouth and down its short thick throat. Arak ripped and tore the spear free, and the creature finally went silent as it slumped to the ground. He looked about, and there was movement everywhere. In the abandoned buildings, across the rooftops, in the alleys, across the street. Dozens of the nude figures running about with their red eyes reflecting the flames. Arak ran, turning and pumping his legs as he raced deeper into the red light district. He was in the bad position to fight all of them, there were simply too many and he was too exposed. His spear flashed and he cut down a lunging figure. He kept going, twisting his body to slap another leaping figure out of the air with his shield. The crunch of bones and the splat of it against the building brought a grim smile to his face. Arak left the main street, darting through an alley and emerging into the middle of fierce scrum. Bodies, demons and humans, were intermixed, fighting and slashing, crushing and killing, in a mixed frenzy of rage. Arak looked about the tight confines of the street and something was wrong. The Imperial citizens' eyes were wide and fierce, spittle covered their mouths as they attacked anything that moved. Alara demon. Clubs, glass, bricks, and balled-up fists were being used with impunity, regardless of the damage attacking with them caused. Arak felt something tug at him, in his gut, where the ball of rage sat since the beginning of all of this. The injustice, the murder, the dishonor. All of it came rising like a burning tide up his gut and filling his heart and mind as his vision clouded red. Cold froze it all. From his shoulders and spine a chilling frost rolled down him, containing that inferno of hatred. Arak gasped as he regained himself and glanced backward to the alley he had just emerged from. None of the leeches had followed him, but there was still movement on the tightly packed rooftops. Arak looked back over the fight, scanning and trying to see what was out of place. The scrum of flesh was hard to see through, but he saw something standing still. Where everything was kinetic and violent, the immobility of one was impossible to ignore. Arak turned and started to muscle his way toward the newest demon. Chapter 43. The demon turned and locked eyes with Arak, and he felt the cold intensify, shooting down his spine in a frigid blast that could rival the North Pole in the dead of winter. The explosion of heat that ballooned through him met the frost, and they interlocked in a monstrous battle in his chest, the pain nearly bowing Arak over. It was tall and skeletal with ruby-red skin, white scar lines around its cloudy white eyes, as if it had raked its own face with its small claws. It squinted and the pain worsened in Arak's chest. All around him people began to scream and thrash, attacking everything around them as the street became a glimpse of hell. Arak shoved the woman half his size who tried to stab him with a piece of glass, and then speared a hellspawn as it whirled on him with a knife in its hand. The crowd parted and Arak lunged free, aiming his spear at the thin demon. It leapt back, its speed impressive, and Arak cursed it as a pair of hulking ape-like creatures interceded. They were flat-faced and overly muscled, with bronze armor across their broad chests and dark warhammers clutched in hairy knuckles. Arak's vision was red at the edges as he struggled to fight against the demon's effect on him. Simian Guard LVL 21. A proliferate species who sells their aggressive services cheaply. Rage Demon LVL 23. Specially bred on the fifth plane of hell, they cast a powerful rage aura. Arak grunted as a hammer blow hit his shield and staggered him back. He sidestepped an overhand strike, and the black iron hammer buried itself in the cobblestone street in an explosion of stony shrapnel that peppered his shins. Arak stabbed at the simian, but the creature twisted and Arak left nothing but a thin trail of blood leaking down its tanned, bare face. It hooted in surprise and leapt backward as its partner surged forward. The ugly beasts were nearly as strong as Arak, and stuck as he was fighting both at the same time. It was a challenge. Finally a challenge. Arak twisted as the next hammer arrived, sliding it off his shield and to the side as he stabbed at the original guard. It wasn't as fast as its counterpart, and the spear dug into its side, piercing its bronze armor and burying itself in the simian's rib cage. The creature howled in anger and pain and punched Arak in the face, his helm rattling as Arak's head snapped back. Arak left the spear and drew his sword with a fluid motion as he knocked the second ape's hammer aside with a clean parry. He dashed forward, and sent 3 slashes as fast as he could, his wrists snapping with every strike. The simian backed up as Arak slashed a blood furrow through its thick quadricep. The first ape yanked the spear out of its side and let it clatter to the ground as it lunged back at Arak. Arak forced the 2 wounded simians to a standstill, his shield and sword parrying every blow. Every ounce of his attention was focused on the 2 enemies in front of him, the rage demon backing away. Arak burst forward with an explosive motion, tanking a hammer strike to his pauldron, to run over the simian he had stabbed with his spear. The ape lifted its 2-handed hammer and his sword skated over the handle of the hammer. Arak pressed down, using his heightened strength to force the hammer low, the edge of the sword on the simian's neck. Arak sliced across the beast's neck and a spray of hot blood washed across Arak. He shoved the ape to the ground, lowering his shoulder and shoving it off its feet. He spun around just in time to see a wide-headed hammer falling towards his head. Arak dropped to a knee and interposed his shield, and the blow rattled his bones as he stopped the hammer in midair. The creature was overextended and Arak simply thrust his sword straight out into the ape's gut. The sword parted bronze like paper and the creature hooted once softly and then fell to the ground dead. Arak rose up and over it and shook his shoulder out, seeing the large dent in his kite shield where he had stopped the hammer. Arak looked for the rage demon and saw it, scurrying around the edge of the field of the scrum. It dipped and slipped between combatants, no one reacting to the demon as if it didn't exist. Arak sheathed his sword and grabbed the spear, twisting it in his hand and hefting it up. Arak took 2 skip steps and hurtled the spear with a grunt. The spear flashed across the distance in a flash, blowing straight through a hellspawn and piercing the rage demon's leg. The demon staggered and screamed as it fell into the scrum. Its scream rippled across the crowd and the mob's fury increased as they cut and slashed without discerning friend from foe. A man stabbed at Arak with a piece of blackened wood. Arak gently pushed him away as he stalked toward the rage demon. He was gentle with his pushing, setting people to the side as he loomed over the demon. It whirled on him, kicking at Arak's knee with its good leg. Arak's knee bent back, but didn't break. Arak gritted his teeth and drew his sword, slashing apart the offending appendage. The demon's scream was stopped as Arak lopped off its head, watching as the conical head rolled away. The after effects of its aura took a few moments to fade away, the people slowly coming down from their rage-induced mob behavior. Scores of demons backed away, melting into the darkness the moment the rage demon was killed. Arak looked back at where the mass blood leeches had been and saw the tide of albino monsters coming now. The hellspawn rose up and into the night's air as the leeches flooded into the alley. Over 100 of the flappy creatures scurried toward them, running or crawling across walls, the road, or jumping across the rooftops. The crowd of shell-shocked citizens looked about, their eyes clearing of rage and filling with fear as the ravenous horde came at them. Arak roared, a soundless challenge of dominance as he stepped in front of the bulk of the crowd. His shield and sword rising up as the horde fell upon him. Talons scraped and slashed, each strike staggering him as his sword turned into a silver haze. The creatures fell apart like badly constructed toys, limbs popping free with every slash, bones weak and flesh rubbery. People screamed behind him as the crowd of leeches flowed around him like a wave did a stone. Arak stabbed and slashed, killing with every other blow, but there were too many. The battle had dissolved into a massacre as Arak built a rampart of corpses around himself. Rally! Fight! A woman's voice billowed behind him and a sense of confidence filled Arak. A stream of warriors, dressed in silks and gauzy underclothes with naked steel in their hands, came in a roaring wave. A handful of heavily armored figures formed a wedge and pushed through the stream of leeches, the woman who had shouted behind them, lifting an old officer's saber over her head. Chapter 44. Leeches latched onto people with a suicidal determination, their teeth biting into flesh even as steel tore through them. A madness gripped them, their eyes wide and wild as the stench of blood filled the street in an overwhelming blanket that coated the air. Every leech was in a frenzy, jaws snapping as desperation drove them. The rush of reinforcements blunted the crazed rush, freezing them in their tracks as battle lines formed. Arak was behind enemy lines. The wedge of armored fighters were 15 or so feet down the street from him, a wall of teeth and claws between them. Arak roared again, his throat raw and painful, and swung his sword about in wide sweeping blows. His aura mingled with the bloodlust of the monsters and the line of Imperials began to match the leeches in ferocity. Blood was pouring like a river across the cobblestones. Every wide sweep of the sword took rubbery limbs and the sound of talons on his armor filled his ears, a shriek that set his teeth on edge. He crushed another of the leeches to the ground with his shield and then stomped on the creature. His boots slipped a bit and he nearly fell to his knees and under the massive claws and fangs. "We're coming. Hold fast." The woman yelled towards him. Arak just kept cutting. Another body slapped the ground while its head went up into the air. A pair of hands gripped the thin edge where his breastplate met gorget and pulled them downward, the creature's strength supernatural. The sword was stuck in another leech's head and he let go of the pommel and reached around and jerked free the knife. The bronze blade split the leech's gut with ease, bathing Arak's hand with hot blood. Arak stabbed it twice more and the creature's grasp weakened and then slipped free. Another grabbed at his back and shoulders, then another to a leg, trying to lift it up and topple him backward. Arak forced his leg down, crushing fingers and having the leech scream in pain as Arak's boot ground fingers into stone. The leech on his back was still there, weighing him down as Arak knifed the leech whose hands he had pinned down. The weight disappeared and Arak was free to keep fighting again. The pressure of the leech wave was being forced back as more and more Imperials flooded into the street and entered Arak's aura field. The desire to keep going, to chase them down the alleyway they had flooded out of, was rampant. Arak focused on the feeling of the weight of the battle thrill and imagined it breaking apart. Essence unraveled and the aura broke apart, leaving over 100 panting Imperials standing panting in the street. Leeches lay thick and mixed with the hellspawn and dead Imperials. The cluster of armored figures broke apart and revealed the woman who had been shouting for him to hold. His heart sank. The family resemblance was too strong to ignore. She was gorgeous, with blood speckled across high cheekbones and eyes filled with feverish light. Her auburn hair was tightly bound in the slightest tilt of her ears and the deceptively muscular build. She was built like a gymnast with a flat stomach and powerful thighs. A pair of courtesans clung to her side, their eyes wide and filled with adoration. "I'm Illyria Greenbow, the 16th Prince of the Throne." Her voice was musical and rang like chimes in the wind. Arak sighed loudly then cleaned his knife off and sheathed it. He wrapped on his armor, hoping to wake Pomp up from his nap. "Tell me, warrior, your name?" she asked, watching with amused emerald eyes as Iraq waited for Pump to wake up. The sleeping dragon didn't rouse himself, so Iraq quickly started to sign. Silent tongue. Of course, I am not a savage, the princess said with a laugh. I have come to find the mantle-bearer of the Sword of Empire. The mantle is an old sword that the captain of the ship carried, Iraq said. They both stopped and stared at the sword in the woman's hand. It was an old blade, a sense of antiquity clutching to it even though it was perfectly maintained. There was a hint of blue along the steel, a ripple that only appeared when the light reflected just right as Illyria twisted it this way and that. Ah, an old man had this when it all started. He was with Jules here, and well, he died with the blade unstained. I rectified that mistake, Illyria said. Jules was one of the two courtesans next to her, a short muscular woman with black hair tied up in a thick bun. The Sword of Empire sent me to retrieve you so you could activate the ship's systems. What do you mean by that? Is the ship alive or something? She said, laughing. Iraq nodded solemnly. You're being serious. That ancient killing machine is alive? Iraq nodded again. Well, fuck me, the princess muttered. Already did, someone muttered in the crowd. The princess rolled her eyes at that, then looked around where they were at. This is the wrong place for this. These leeches have been flooding this area fairly regularly. We haven't had trouble holding them back, but that last wave with whatever that thing was, she waved at where Iraq had killed the rage demon. We had to retreat or risk all of us succumbing to the affliction. We have a base close by, one of the bars that we've fortified. We've managed to rally quite a few survivors and I won't leave them here. Iraq nodded in agreement and then went and pulled the sword out of the leech's skull. He wiped the blade on a dead man's partially clean shirt and then went and retrieved his spear. Most of the crowd had retreated, with just the princess and her small posse waiting for him. They led him away from the scene of the battle and down another side street. Here the buildings were more squat, wide windows broken apart and covered with bar furniture. Men and women walked about, their dress not appropriate for the battlefield, wielding weapons won from their foe. Iraq saw spears and swords and knives that all of the infernal soldiers had used. The scenes of violence were rampant and there was a pile of shrouded corpses off to the side, crimson-stained sheets over them. Hundreds were clustered about and walking with haunted eyes in a range of strange clothes, from party-going sheer gowns, to hearty and well-made work clothes of janitorial staff. In here, Illyria said, pointing to one of the bars. A red swan with a long neck stretched to the side was painted over the door. A burly guard, who looked to have a trace of giant blood, stood with a thick cudgel in his hand. He waved them through, his dark eyes looking at the milling crowds with suspicion. When we didn't fold immediately, and I began to rally this area, there was a demon. A ship changer. It nearly killed me. If it wasn't for the sacrifice of one of my companions, I would be dead, Illyria said when she noticed Iraq looking at the guard. Pump's head emerged from his shoulder and the dragon stretched its jaws, yawned widely and looked around with sleepy eyes. What did I miss? Tope continued.